the Red Baron, the sky warrior who redefined the Great War. In the autumn of 1914, when the great armies of Europe marched into what they believed would be a swift and glorious war, the skies above the battlefields remained largely empty. Aviation itself was barely a decade old, a curiosity of wood and canvas that had captured the imagination of daredevils and dreamers. The Wright brothers had achieved powered flight only 11 years earlier, and the aircraft that now appeared over the trenches of the Western Front were fragile things, held together with wire and fabric, their engines sputtering and unreliable. These early machines were not weapons of war. They were eyes in the sky, observation platforms from which pilots and their observers could peer down upon enemy positions and report troop movements. The pilots who flew them were often sportsmen, men who had raced automobiles or sailed yachts, drawn to this new frontier by the promise of adventure. They waved to one another as they passed in the air, gentlemen acknowledging gentlemen, even as their nations tore each other apart in the mud below. But the skies of Europe were changing. As the war settled into the grinding stalemate of trench warfare, both sides recognized the strategic value of controlling the airspace above the battlefield. Pilots began carrying pistols and rifles aloft, taking potshots at enemy aircraft in desperate, awkward encounters. Soon, machine guns were mounted to aircraft, though the challenge of firing through a spinning propeller without shooting off one's own blades remained a deadly puzzle. When the Germans developed the interrupter gear in 1915, allowing bullets to pass between propeller blades, the nature of aerial warfare transformed overnight. The age of the fighter pilot had begun, and from this crucible of innovation and bloodshed would emerge a figure who would become synonymous with aerial combat itself, a man whose red-painted aircraft would strike terror into Allied pilots, and whose legend would endure long after the guns fell silent. His name was Manfred von Richthofen, but the world would know him by another name, the Red Baron. The making of a Prussian officer. To understand the man behind the legend, we must return to his beginnings, to the Prussia of the late 19th century, where the values of duty, discipline, and honor were woven into the fabric of aristocratic life. Manfred Albrecht Freiherr von Richthofen was born on May 2, 1892, in Breslau, in the province of Silesia, then part of the German Empire. He was the eldest son of Major Albrecht von Richthofen and Kunigunde von Richthofen, both members of the Prussian nobility, a class that had for generations provided officers to serve the Kaiser. The young Manfred grew up in an environment where military service was not merely expected but was considered the highest calling for a man of noble birth. His childhood was spent largely at the family estate in Schweidnitz, where he developed the passions that would shape his character. He was an avid outdoorsman, a skilled horseman, and, above all, a hunter. The forests and fields of Silesia became his training ground, where he learned patience, precision, and the stillness required to track and take down game. These were not mere hobbies, but disciplines, practiced with the same seriousness that another child might apply to mathematics or music. By his own later admission, Manfred was not a particularly gifted student in traditional academics. He found the classroom confining, the rote memorization of facts tedious. What stirred his blood was action, movement, the testing of oneself against nature and circumstance. His father recognized this restless energy and, when Manfred was 11 years old, enrolled him in the military school at Wallstatt. It was a harsh environment, designed to forge boys into officers, to instill obedience and martial virtue through rigorous discipline. At Wallstatt, and later at the Royal Prussian Military Academy at Lichterfelde, Manfred proved himself an adequate but unremarkable cadet. He excelled in athletics and gymnastics, demonstrating the physical coordination and competitive spirit that would serve him well in years to come. Yet, there were no early signs of greatness, no indication that this young officer candidate would one day become the most celebrated fighter pilot of the First World War. In 1911, at the age of 19, Manfred received his commission as a cavalry officer in the Ulan Regiment, a proud unit with a distinguished history. For the young von Richthofen, this seemed the fulfillment of his family's expectations. He imagined a career of charges and sabers, of leading men on horseback in the grand tradition of Prussian cavalry. He could not have known that he was entering a profession already made obsolete by the machinery of modern war. The death of cavalry and the birth of wings. When war erupted in August 1914, Manfred von Richthofen rode to the front with his regiment, eager to prove himself in battle. But the reality of 20th-century warfare quickly shattered the romantic notions of cavalry glory. The Western Front became a landscape of barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery craters where horses were not instruments of swift maneuver, but targets, vulnerable and tragic. The cavalry, that ancient arm of warfare, found itself relegated to messenger duties and reconnaissance, far from the decisive charges of old. For an ambitious young officer like Richthofen, this was intolerable. He had not trained for war to carry dispatches behind the lines. He wanted to be where the fighting was, where he could make a difference. His frustration grew as the war settled into its grim pattern of stalemate. Then, in the spring of 1915, he witnessed something that would change the course of his life. He saw an aircraft, one of those fragile flying machines, pass overhead. The idea struck him with sudden clarity. If glory and action were no longer to be found on horseback, perhaps they could be found in the sky. Richthofen wrote to his commanding officer, requesting a transfer to the Imperial German Air Service. The request was approved, and in May 1915, he reported for training as an aerial observer. This was not yet flying as a pilot, but it was a beginning. He was assigned to work with pilots on reconnaissance missions, learning the basics of aerial combat, while someone else controlled the aircraft. It was during one of these early flights that he experienced his first aerial engagement, firing a machine gun at an enemy aircraft. The encounter was inconclusive, but something fundamental had awakened in him. He had found his calling, yet becoming an observer was not enough. Richthofen wanted to be at the controls, to master the aircraft himself. He applied for pilot training and was accepted, despite having no particular mechanical aptitude or natural gift for flying. His early attempts were, by his own account, clumsy. His first solo flight nearly ended in disaster when he crashed the aircraft on landing. His instructors were less than impressed, and there were moments when it seemed he might wash out of flight school entirely. But what Richthofen lacked in natural talent, he compensated for with sheer determination and discipline. Flying, he came to understand, was like hunting. It required patience, careful observation of one's prey, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. He applied the lessons learned in the forests of Silesia to the skies over Europe. Slowly, methodically, he improved. By October 1915, he had earned his pilot's certificate and was assigned to a reconnaissance squadron on the Eastern Front. For months, he flew observation missions, photographing enemy positions and directing artillery fire. The work was important but unglamorous, and Richthofen chafed at the limitations. He wanted to fight, to engage enemy aircraft in single combat. That opportunity would come in 1916, when he encountered a man who would transform him from a competent pilot into a lethal hunter of the skies. The master and the student. Oswald Boelcke was already a legend when Manfred von Richthofen met him. He was Germany's leading ace, a pilot who had developed many of the tactics that would define air combat for the remainder of the war. Boelcke was not merely skilled, he was thoughtful, analytical, a man who studied the physics of aerial combat and codified his findings into principles that could be taught. His Dicta Boelcke would become the foundation of fighter tactics, emphasizing altitude advantage, sun position, surprise, and the importance of staying with one's target until it was destroyed. When Boelcke was tasked with forming a new fighter squadron, Jagdstaffel II, in August 1916, he handpicked his pilots from across the German air service. Among those he selected was Manfred von Richthofen, who was then stationed on the Eastern Front. The choice was not obvious. Richthofen had yet to score a confirmed victory. But Boelcke saw something in the young officer, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit, someone with the discipline and focus necessary to excel in this new form of warfare. Under Boelcke's tutelage, Richthofen began to transform. He learned to approach combat not with reckless aggression, but with cold calculation. Boelcke taught him to study his opponents, to identify their weaknesses, to strike from advantageous positions, and disengage when the situation turned unfavorable. Air combat, Boelcke emphasized, was not about chivalry or daring. It was about killing the enemy before he killed you. The most successful pilots were not the bravest, but the most methodical. On September 17, 1916, Richthofen achieved his first confirmed aerial victory, shooting down a British aircraft over Cambrai. The moment was transformative. He later wrote that watching the enemy aircraft fall, seeing the crew's desperate attempts to regain control before the final impact, filled him with a hunter's satisfaction. It was, he said, like shooting his first stag. There was no pleasure in the death of the men inside, but there was profound satisfaction in the successful hunt, in the application of skill and the achievement of victory. From that moment, Richthofen approached aerial combat with single-minded focus. He kept meticulous records of his victories, noting the type of aircraft, the location, the tactical situation. He ordered silver cups, engraved with the details of each kill, a tradition he would maintain until the supply of silver in Germany grew too scarce to continue. His tally began to climb. 2 victories, 5, 10. Each engagement refined his technique, sharpened his instincts. Tragedy struck in October 1916, when Oswald Boelcke was killed in a mid-air collision with one of his own pilots during a dogfight. Richthofen was devastated by the loss of his mentor, but he also understood that Boelcke's legacy lived on in the pilots he had trained and the tactics he had taught. Richthofen resolved to honor his teacher by becoming the best fighter pilot in the German air service. It was not mere ambition, it was a form of tribute, a continuation of Boelcke's work. The birth of the Red Baron. By January 1917, Manfred von Richthofen had 16 confirmed victories and had taken command of his own squadron, Jagdstaffel 11. He was 24 years old, a commander responsible for the lives and training of other pilots. The weight of this responsibility shaped his leadership style. He was demanding but fair, expecting from his men the same discipline and precision he demanded of himself. He continued to emphasize Boelcke's principles, drilling his pilots in tactics until they became second nature. It was during this period that Richthofen made a decision that would cement his legend. He ordered his Albatros D3 fighter painted entirely in bright red. The choice was both practical and psychological. The distinctive color made it easy for his squadron mates to identify him in the chaos of a dogfight, allowing them to follow his lead and coordinate their attacks. But it also served as a challenge to the enemy, a declaration that he was not hiding, that he welcomed combat. The red aircraft became a symbol that transcended military identification. Allied pilots began to speak of the Red Devil, or Le Diable Rouge, the crimson predator that appeared without warning and left destruction in its wake. British newspapers picked up the story, and the public, hungry for narratives that could make sense of the industrial slaughter of the trenches, latched onto the figure of the Red Baron. Here was warfare that still contained elements of individual heroism, of skill and courage that could be understood and celebrated. Richthofen himself was ambivalent about his fame. He recognized its propaganda value for Germany, and he understood that his image helped maintain morale at home. But he remained fundamentally a hunter, focused on the work itself rather than the glory it brought. In his writing, he was matter-of-fact about combat, describing victories in technical terms, analyzing what had gone right or wrong. He expressed respect for his opponents, particularly the skilled ones, but he never romanticized the killing. War, he knew, was a deadly serious business. April 1917 became known as Bloody April for the Royal Flying Corps. Richthofen and his squadron achieved devastating success against British aircraft, many of which were obsolete and flown by inexperienced pilots rushed to the front to replace mounting losses. During this single month, Richthofen personally shot down 21 enemy aircraft, bringing his total to 52 victories. He had become the highest-scoring ace on any side of the war, surpassing the achievements of both German and Allied pilots. The German High Command promoted him to command of Jagdgeschwader 1, a fighter wing composed of 4 squadrons. This larger formation became known as the Flying Circus, partly because of the brightly colored aircraft flown by its pilots, each painted in distinctive patterns to aid identification, and partly because the unit moved frequently along the front, traveling by train to wherever the fighting was fiercest, much like a traveling circus. The man behind the myth. What manner of man was Manfred von Richthofen? Those who knew him described a figure far more complex than the propaganda image suggested. He was not a swaggering braggart or a bloodthirsty killer. In person, he was often quiet and reserved, more comfortable in the company of his hunting dogs than at social gatherings. He had little patience for small talk, and detested the celebrity that increasingly surrounded him. His letters home to his mother reveal a young man deeply attached to his family, concerned about the welfare of his younger brothers, who also served in the military. He wrote about his hunting trips during leaves, about the simple pleasures of walking through forests, about his hope that the war would end soon so that life could return to normal. These were not the words of a man who loved war for its own sake, but of someone who saw it as a duty to be fulfilled, a task requiring his best effort. Yet there was also a coldness in his approach to combat that disturbed some who knew him. He spoke of aerial victories in the language of the hunt, referring to his opponents as game, and describing the moment of the kill with clinical detachment. This was partly a psychological defense mechanism, a way of maintaining emotional distance from the grim reality that he was killing other human beings, many of them as young as himself, but it also reflected his Prussian upbringing, the aristocratic values that emphasize duty and performance of one's role regardless of personal feeling. Richthofen was critical of pilots he deemed reckless or undisciplined. He had no patience for those who took unnecessary risks, or who treated aerial combat as a sport rather than a profession. He repeatedly emphasized to his pilots that their goal was not to be heroes but to destroy enemy aircraft while preserving their own lives and machines. A dead pilot, however brave, was useless to Germany. Survival and efficiency were the marks of the true professional. In July 1917, Richthofen suffered a serious head wound during a dogfight. A bullet grazed his skull, temporarily blinding him and causing him to lose consciousness while still airborne. Only through extraordinary effort and considerable luck did he manage to land the aircraft safely. The injury required weeks of recovery, and those who saw him afterward noticed a change. He suffered from persistent headaches and seemed more withdrawn, more somber. Some historians have speculated that the head wound caused lasting neurological damage that affected his judgment in the months that followed. Despite medical advice to remain on the ground, Richthofen returned to combat. By this point in the war, the Allies had achieved technical parity and even superiority in some aircraft types. The British Sopwith Camel and SE-5 and the French Spad were formidable machines in the hands of skilled pilots. The days of easy victories were over. Every flight into combat now carried substantial risk, and Richthofen knew it. He could have accepted a training or staff position, could have traded on his fame for a safer posting. He chose to remain with his squadron. The spring of 1918. As winter gave way to spring in 1918, both sides knew the war was approaching its climax. Germany had launched its Great Spring Offensive in March, a desperate gamble to break through Allied lines before American forces could arrive in decisive numbers. The skies above the Western Front swarmed with aircraft, as both sides struggled for air superiority to support their ground operations. Richthofen's victory count had reached 80 by April 1918, an almost incomprehensible total when one considers that each victory represented a successful engagement with a determined opponent, often in the midst of swirling dogfights where death could come from any direction. He had survived longer than any German fighter pilot had a right to expect. Many of the men who had served under Boelcke, who had flown with Richthofen in the early days, were dead. New pilots arrived at the Flying Circus, boys really, with only a few hours of flight training, and Richthofen knew that most would not survive their first month at the front. He wrote to his mother in early April, expressing a weariness that was unusual for him. He confessed that he felt worn down, that the constant strain of combat was taking its toll. Yet he also wrote that he would continue to fly, that it was his duty to lead his men and to fight for Germany. There was a fatalistic quality to these letters, a sense that he knew his luck could not hold forever, but that he would continue regardless. On the morning of April 21, 1918, Richthofen took off on what would be his final flight. The weather was clear, visibility good. His squadron was tasked with patrol duties over the Somme River Valley, an area of intense ground fighting. Around mid-morning, they encountered a formation of British aircraft, and a dogfight developed. Richthofen pursued a Sopwith Camel flown by a young Canadian pilot named Wilfred Wop May, who was on only his second combat mission. May, inexperienced and panicked, dove toward the ground in an attempt to escape. Richthofen followed, closing in for the kill. This was unusual behavior for him. His tactics typically emphasized remaining at altitude, striking quickly, and disengaging, but he continued the pursuit, descending low over the Australian positions along the ground. It was then that everything went wrong. Multiple sources of fire converged on the red Fokker Dr. I triplane. Australian machine gunners on the ground opened fire. Another aircraft, flown by Canadian Captain Roy Brown, dove on Richthofen from above, firing a burst from his twin Vickers guns. Richthofen's aircraft shuddered. He was hit. The exact sequence of what happened next has been debated for over a century. What is known is that Richthofen's aircraft made a controlled landing in a field near the village of Vaux-sur-Somme, behind Allied lines. Australian soldiers reached the crashed aircraft within moments. They found Manfred von Richthofen slumped in the cockpit, mortally wounded by a single bullet that had entered through his right side and passed through his chest, damaging his heart and lungs. He spoke a single word, kaput, meaning broken or finished, and then died. The mystery of the final bullet, the question of who killed the Red Baron, became one of the enduring controversies of the First World War. Captain Roy Brown was officially credited with the victory, and he believed until his death that his bullets had struck Richthofen. But medical examination of Richthofen's body suggested that the fatal bullet had traveled upward through his torso, a trajectory more consistent with ground fire than with an attack from another aircraft. Several Australian machine gunners claimed to have fired at the red triplane as it flew low over their positions. The most compelling claim came from Sergeant Cedric Popkin of the Australian 24th Machine Gun Company, whose position and angle of fire aligned with the wound's trajectory. In the decades since, historians and ballistics experts have examined the evidence repeatedly, and while certainty remains elusive, many now believe that Richthofen was most likely killed by ground fire rather than by Brown's attack from the air. For Richthofen himself, the question would have been academic. He had been shot down, and shot down behind enemy lines. For a pilot of his experience and caution, the pursuit of May so low over enemy positions represented a departure from his own principles, a violation of the very rules he had taught his pilots. Some have suggested that the lingering effects of his head wound impaired his judgment. Others argue that simple fatigue, the accumulated strain of 3 years of combat, caused a momentary lapse. It is also possible that in that instant, pursuing an inexperienced enemy pilot, something of the young hunter emerged, focused on the quarry to the exclusion of all else. The Australians who reached Richthofen's aircraft were in an unusual position. They had just killed the most famous enemy pilot of the war, but they also recognized that they were in the presence of a warrior who had earned respect through his skill and courage. They treated his body with honor. Souvenir hunters soon descended, stripping pieces from the aircraft and even cutting away parts of his flying suit, but the body itself was protected. The British conducted an autopsy and then prepared Richthofen for burial with full military honors. On April 22, 1918, he was buried in the cemetery at Bertangles, near Amiens. An honor guard of British and Australian officers attended. A wreath was placed on his grave with the inscription, "To Captain von Richthofen, our valiant and worthy foe." Aircraft from the Royal Flying Corps flew over the ceremony and dropped a photograph of the funeral behind German lines, along with a message informing them of their ace's death and honorable burial. The reckoning. News of Richthofen's death sent shockwaves through Germany. He had been more than a military hero. He had been a symbol of German prowess, proof that individual excellence still mattered in an age of industrial warfare. The propaganda ministry had built him into a figure larger than life, and his death was a psychological blow to a nation already showing signs of war weariness. Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered a period of mourning. Newspapers published tributes emphasizing Richthofen's nobility, his chivalry, his representation of the best qualities of German manhood. His family received condolences from across the nation. His younger brother Lothar, also a fighter pilot and ace, survived the war, but was deeply affected by Manfred's death. Among Allied pilots, the reaction was complex. Many had feared the Red Baron, had known that an encounter with him would likely mean death, but they also recognized him as a professional, a man who fought cleanly and who represented the warrior ethos that many of them also held. Even as they fought against him, the destruction of an enemy was cause for celebration. But the death of a worthy opponent brought a strange sort of melancholy. Major Charles Woolley, a British pilot, perhaps captured this sentiment best when he wrote, "We are sorry that he is dead. He was a brave man, a clean fighter, and an aristocrat. May he rest in peace." This was the paradox of aerial combat in the Great War. These men killed each other with regularity, yet often felt more kinship with their opposite numbers in the sky than with the generals and politicians who directed the war from afar. The German air service continued without Richthofen, but his loss was deeply felt. Command of the Flying Circus passed to other pilots, but none achieved his combination of skill, leadership, and symbolic importance. The war itself would grind on for another 7 months, before the armistice in November 1918. By then, the entire conflict had claimed the lives of millions, and even the famous Red Baron was just one more name in the endless ledger of the dead. The legend takes flight. In the years following the war, Manfred von Richthofen's legend only grew. His autobiography, Der Rote Kampfflieger, The Red Fighter Pilot, published in 1917, became an international bestseller, translated into multiple languages. The book presented Richthofen's own voice, his matter-of-fact descriptions of combat, his emphasis on discipline and technique over bravado. It became a foundational text for military aviators and influenced fighter tactics in the decades that followed. In Germany during the interwar period, Richthofen was commemorated as a national hero. Streets, schools, and monuments were named in his honor. The Nazi regime later appropriated his image, using him as an exemplar of Aryan martial virtue, a distortion that would have been deeply ironic to the man himself, who had fought in a different war under different circumstances, and who had shown respect to opponents of all nationalities. In Allied nations, Richthofen's reputation evolved from feared enemy to respected historical figure. Books, films, and documentaries explored his life and career. The 1930 Hollywood film, Hell's Angels, and later productions, brought the era of World War I aerial combat to popular audiences. Richthofen, with his distinctive red aircraft and record of victories, became the central figure in these narratives, the archetype of the fighter ace. The actual Fokker Dr. I triplane in which he died was largely destroyed by souvenir hunters, with pieces scattered to collections around the world. Various aircraft museums claim to possess his last aircraft, though authentication proved difficult. In 1925, Richthofen's body was exhumed from the cemetery at Bertangels and returned to Germany, where it was reburied with full military honors in the Invalidenfriedhof Cemetery in Berlin. In 1975, it was moved again to the family plot in Wiesbaden, where it remains today. Aviation historians have studied every aspect of Richthofen's career, analyzing his tactics, his leadership, and his psychology. His 80 confirmed victories remain the highest total for any pilot in World War I, though the exact number has been debated due to varying confirmation standards between nations and the chaos of combat, where claims sometimes overlapped or could not be verified. What is beyond dispute is that he was extraordinarily effective, surviving far longer than probability suggested he should have, and achieving a level of success that few others approached. The price of the sky. To understand Richthofen's significance, we must remember the context in which he fought. The First World War represented the first time in human history that the three-dimensional battlefield extended into the sky. The men who fought there were pioneers, developing tactics and technologies in real time, often learning through fatal mistakes. The average life expectancy of a new fighter pilot on the Western Front was measured in weeks. That Richthofen survived for nearly 3 years of combat operations was itself remarkable. The aircraft they flew were primitive by any modern standard. They were constructed of wood frames covered with fabric, held together with wire bracing. The engines were unreliable, prone to failure. There were no parachutes. The German High Command feared they would encourage cowardice, an abandonment of the aircraft at the first sign of trouble. Pilots who were hit and whose aircraft caught fire faced a terrible choice: burn to death or jump. Many chose the latter. Manfred von Richthofen flew in this environment, mastered it, and survived far longer than most. His success came not from superior equipment but from discipline, patience, and tactical acumen. He understood that the victor in aerial combat was usually the pilot who saw the enemy first, who positioned himself advantageously, and who pressed his attack only when success was probable. Reckless aggression led to quick death. Cool calculation led to survival and victory. But we must also acknowledge what Richthofen was: a killer, albeit one sanctioned by his nation, and operating within the rules of war, as they were then understood. He shot down and killed 80 enemy pilots and observers. Each of those men had families who mourned them, futures that were extinguished. Richthofen himself never expressed regret for these deaths, but neither did he celebrate them. He approached combat as a professional duty, something to be done well because his nation required it of him. This raises uncomfortable questions about heroism and violence, about the celebration of warriors, and the reality of what war demands. Richthofen has been held up as an exemplar of courage and skill, and by the standards of his profession, he was exceptional. Yet his profession was killing, and his exceptional skill meant exceptional lethality. Modern audiences must grapple with this tension between admiration for his abilities and recognition of the essential horror of what he did. The enduring symbol, more than a century after his death, Manfred von Richthofen remains the most famous fighter pilot in history. His image, particularly the red Fokker triplane, has become iconic, recognized even by those who know nothing else about World War I. He has been referenced in countless books, films, and works of art. The cartoon character Snoopy famously imagines himself dueling with the Red Baron atop his doghouse, introducing the legend to generations of children who know nothing of the real man or the war he fought in. This popular remembrance, while often historically inaccurate, speaks to something fundamental about Richthofen's appeal. In an age of industrial warfare, where millions died anonymously in trenches, where artillery shells fell without regard to individual courage or skill, the fighter pilots offered a return to a more comprehensible form of combat. Here were individuals testing themselves in single combat, where skill and courage mattered. It was, in some ways, the last war where such individual heroics were possible before warfare became entirely mechanized and impersonal. Richthofen embodied this ideal while also recognizing its limits. He was not a romantic, but a realist. He knew that war was brutal, and that survival required discipline and caution. Yet he also understood that there was a role for the warrior, for the professional who could perform his duty with excellence. This combination of romantic ideal and professional reality makes him a compelling figure, neither pure hero nor simple villain, but a complex man caught in extraordinary circumstances. For students of military history, Richthofen's career offers valuable lessons. His emphasis on tactics over technology, on patience over aggression, on professional skill over individual heroics, influenced fighter doctrine for generations. The principles he learned from Boelcke, and refined through his own experience, formed the foundation of air combat tactics that remained relevant through World War II and beyond. Modern fighter pilots still study the concept of energy management, of altitude advantage, of using the sun to blind opponents, all concepts that Richthofen and his contemporaries developed over the trenches of France. The human cost. As we conclude this journey through Manfred von Richthofen's life, we must return to the fundamental reality. He died at 25 years old, shot from the sky over a field in France, far from the forests of Silesia where he had learned to hunt. Whatever legend has been built around him, whatever symbolic importance he has acquired, he was ultimately a young man whose life was cut short by war. How many other brilliant careers, how many other potential leaders and innovators died with him and with the millions of others who perished in that conflict? The First World War consumed an entire generation of European youth, and while we remember a few names like Richthofen, the vast majority died unknown and unremembered, their potential unrealized, their futures erased. This is perhaps the final lesson of the Red Baron's story. We can admire skill and courage, we can study tactics and celebrate excellence, but we must never lose sight of the cost. War, even when conducted with chivalry and honor, remains a fundamentally destructive enterprise. The fact that Richthofen fought cleanly, that he respected his opponents, that he embodied certain warrior virtues, does not change the basic tragedy that he and they were engaged in the business of killing one another. In his writings, Richthofen occasionally expressed hope that the war would end, that he could return to the simple pleasures of hunting in the forests, of spending time with his family, of living a normal life. He never got that chance. Instead, his name became synonymous with aerial combat, his red aircraft an eternal symbol of that brief, terrible period when men first brought war to the skies. Conclusion: the shadow of the Red Wings. On quiet mornings in the Somme Valley, visitors still come to the fields where the Red Baron fell. The landscape has healed from the scars of war, the trenches have been filled in, the shell craters smoothed over. But the memory remains, carried by those who come to stand where history occurred, where a legend ended and began. Manfred von Richthofen's significance extends beyond his 80 victories, beyond his tactical innovations, beyond even his role as a symbol of German military prowess. He represents a particular moment in human history when warfare, for all its horror, still retained elements of individual agency and skill. The fighter pilots of World War I were the last warriors who could truly be said to fight as individuals, where personal courage and ability made a decisive difference. In the century since his death, warfare has become increasingly technological, impersonal, and devastating. Modern fighter pilots engage targets they never see, from distances that would have been incomprehensible to Richthofen. Drones conduct combat with no pilot at risk. War has become, in many ways, what the trenches of World War I presaged: industrial, mechanized, and utterly destructive of individual heroism. Yet we still tell the story of the Red Baron. We still show his red triplane to children, still recount his victories, still debate the circumstances of his death. Perhaps this is because we need to believe that individual courage and skill still matter, that excellence can be achieved even in the darkest circumstances, that there is such a thing as honor even in the midst of horror. Manfred von Richthofen would likely have been uncomfortable with the myth that grew around him. He saw himself not as a hero but as a professional doing his duty. He took pride in his work but did not romanticize it. He knew that he was good at a terrible job, and he did that job until it killed him. This, ultimately, is his legacy. Not the victories or the propaganda or the red aircraft, but the example of a man who faced an impossible task with discipline and excellence, who led others through example, and who paid the ultimate price for his service. He was neither saint nor monster, but a human being caught up in events larger than himself, doing the best he could with the skills he possessed. The skies above Europe have been peaceful now for decades. The roar of combat aircraft has been replaced by the hum of commercial jets carrying passengers to destinations the Red Baron never imagined. But the memory endures of those early days when men first learned to fight in the air, when the sight of a red triplane could inspire terror or hope depending on which side of the lines you stood, when a young Prussian officer became the most feared and respected pilot of his age. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, died on April 21, 1918. But his legend took flight that same day and has never landed. In studying his life, we study not just the history of aviation or the tactics of aerial combat, but the broader questions of duty, honor, skill, and the human cost of war. These questions remain as relevant today as they were over a century ago, ensuring that the story of the Sky Warrior who redefined the retry continue. Great War will continue to be told for generations to come. Epilogue. The silence after the storm. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, 7 months after Richthofen's death, the world that emerged from the wreckage was fundamentally transformed. The old empires had collapsed. The German Empire, which Richthofen had served with such distinction, ceased to exist. The aristocratic world of his youth, with its codes of honor and its certainties about duty and service, had been shattered by the very war that was supposed to have validated those values. Richthofen's family survived the war, but like so many German families of their class, they found themselves adrift in the new reality. His brother, Lothar, who had also become a fighter ace with 40 victories, lived until 1922, before dying in a flying accident. His younger brother Boelcke survived to old age, carrying the family name through the tumultuous decades that followed. The Richthofen estate in Silesia eventually fell behind the Iron Curtain after World War II, lost to the family forever. The veterans of the Air War, those who had fought against Richthofen and survived, often spoke of him with a respect that transcended national boundaries. They had shared an experience that few others could understand, had faced the same fears and challenges, had lost too many friends to the same skies. In the reunions and memoirs that followed, former enemies often found more in common with each other than with those who had never flown in combat. Some of these veterans went on to shape the future of aviation. Hermann Göring, who had commanded the Flying Circus after Richthofen, later became a prominent Nazi leader, perverting the warrior tradition Richthofen had represented into something dark and genocidal. Others, like Ernst Udet, another German ace, contributed to aviation development between the wars, before their skills were pressed into service once again, in an even more terrible conflict. Among Allied veterans, many became pioneers of civilian aviation, using the skills learned in war to open up the skies to commerce and travel. The airmail services, the early airlines, the record-breaking flights of the 1920s and 1930s, All were built on foundations laid by men who had learned to fly in combat. In this sense, Richthofen and his generation of pilots gave birth not just to military aviation, but to the entire modern world of flight. The question of memory, as decades passed and World War I receded into history, the question of how to remember figures like Richthofen became increasingly complex. In Germany, he was honored as a national hero, but the rise of Nazism and the catastrophe of World War II complicated this legacy. Was it appropriate to celebrate a warrior from an earlier war when that warrior's nation had gone on to commit atrocities in a subsequent conflict? Could one separate the man from the uses to which his memory was put? These questions have no easy answers. Richthofen himself bore no responsibility for events that occurred after his death. He fought in a different war, under different circumstances, guided by the codes and values of his time. To judge him by the standards of later eras, or to hold him accountable for how others used his image, seems fundamentally unfair. Yet neither can his legacy be entirely separated from the context of German history in the 20th century. In the Allied nations, the evolution of Richthofen's reputation reflected changing attitudes toward World War I itself. In the immediate aftermath, when wounds were still fresh and grief still raw, he was the enemy, however respected. As time passed, and the war became history, rather than lived experience, it became easier to view him as a historical figure worthy of study and even admiration. By the latter half of the 20th century, he had been transformed into a symbol of a bygone age, the last representative of a form of warfare that no longer existed. This romanticization, while understandable, carries its own dangers. It risks sanitizing war, making it seem noble and glorious rather than brutal and destructive. The reality of aerial combat in World War I was not romantic. Pilots burned alive in their aircraft. They were shot to pieces by machine gun fire. They crashed into the ground from altitudes that turned their bodies into unrecognizable wreckage. Richthofen was good at this work, successful at it, but that does not make the work itself any less horrible. The technical legacy, beyond the symbolism and the mythology, Richthofen left a concrete legacy in the realm of military aviation. The tactics he employed and taught formed the basis of fighter doctrine that remained relevant for decades. His emphasis on teamwork, on coordinated attacks by formations rather than individual duels, anticipated the developments that would define aerial combat in World War II and beyond. The concept of the finger four formation, which became standard in later air forces, was a direct evolution of the tactics developed by Boelcke and refined by Richthofen and his contemporaries. The importance of altitude advantage, of striking from out of the sun, and cause of maintaining situational awareness. All of these principles that Richthofen practiced remained foundational to fighter tactics through the jet age and into the era of modern air combat. His emphasis on gunnery and marksmanship also proved prescient. In an age when machine guns were still relatively new to aircraft, and many pilots sprayed ammunition wildly in the general direction of the enemy, Richthofen insisted on precision. He practiced his shooting, studied ballistics and deflection angles, and trained his pilots to fire short, accurate bursts, rather than long, wasteful sprays. This professionalism, in the technical aspects of combat flying, became the hallmark of successful fighter pilots in all subsequent conflicts. Military historians studying the evolution of air power inevitably return to the First World War and to figures like Richthofen when examining how modern air forces developed their tactics and culture. The German air service of that era, despite ultimately being on the losing side, made innovations in organization, training, and tactics that influenced aviation worldwide. Richthofen was both a product and a shaper of that system, exemplifying its strengths, while also pointing toward future developments. The artists and the Baron. Perhaps no historical figure from World War I has inspired more artistic interpretations than the Red Baron. From paintings and sculptures to novels and films, from comic strips to video games, Richthofen's image has been endlessly reproduced and reimagined. Each generation has found something different in his story, something that speaks to their particular concerns and interests. In the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, films like The Blue Max and Von Richthofen and Brown presented aerial combat as a domain of individual heroism, in contrast to the faceless nuclear standoff that dominated contemporary military thinking. The Red Baron became a symbol of a time when wars could still be understood in human terms, when victory and defeat were decided by skill and courage, rather than by the push of a button. The comic strip, Peanuts, with Snoopy's imaginary battles against the Red Baron, introduced the legend to millions who would never read a history book or watch a documentary. While wholly fantastical, these strips kept the name alive and ensured that even children growing up decades after the war knew who the Red Baron was. Charles Schulz, the strip's creator, had served in World War II and clearly felt an affinity for the earlier conflict's aviators, finding in their story something that resonated across the years. More recently, video games have allowed players to virtually fly World War I aircraft, and even to play as Richthofen himself. These games, while often historically dubious, have introduced yet another generation to the story. They allow players to experience, in however stylized a form, the challenges of early aerial combat, the fragility of the aircraft, the difficulty of gunnery, the constant threat of mechanical failure, or enemy fire. Each of these artistic interpretations, whether reverent or playful, serious or fantastical, has contributed to the enduring nature of the Red Baron legend. They have kept his story alive long after the last veterans of World War I passed away, ensuring that new generations continue to discover and engage with this history. The pilgrimage sites. Today, several locations associated with Richthofen have become pilgrimage sites for aviation enthusiasts and history buffs. The field near Vaux-sur-Somme where he crashed is marked with a memorial stone. Visitors come from around the world to stand on that spot, to imagine the scene that unfolded there on that April morning in 1918, to pay their respects to a warrior from a distant age. The cemetery in Wiesbaden, where his remains now rest, receives a steady stream of visitors. Some leave flowers, others photographs or letters. There is something about Richthofen's story that invites this personal connection, this sense of reaching across time, to acknowledge a life lived with such intensity and cut short so young. Museums around the world display artifacts associated with the Red Baron, pieces of his aircraft, authenticated and otherwise, his medals and decorations, photographs showing him with his squadron, with his dog, alone in the cockpit. These physical remnants serve as tangible links to a past that grows more distant with each passing year, reminders that these were real people, not just characters in a story. The German Air Force maintains the tradition of honoring Richthofen, though always carefully, always aware of the complicated history that followed his death. Modern German fighter squadrons sometimes bear insignia that reference the Flying Circus, though the symbology is adapted to reflect contemporary values. The goal is to honor the professionalism and skill while acknowledging the tragedy of the conflict in which those qualities were employed. The final accounting. As we reach the end of this long examination of Manfred von Richthofen's life and legacy, what final judgments can we make? What lessons should we draw from his story? Perhaps the most important is that war, however skillfully waged, remains a human tragedy. Richthofen was extraordinarily good at what he did, and what he did was kill other young men who were also doing their duty as they understood it. There is a cold mathematics to his 80 victories that we cannot ignore. 80 aircraft destroyed means at least 80 lives ended, or forever changed by injury. Behind each of those numbers was a person, a family, a future that never came to be. Yet we can also recognize that within the confines of that terrible situation, Richthofen conducted himself with a professionalism and a form of honor that commanded respect even from his enemies. He did not glory in killing, he did not abuse his position or engage in atrocities. He fought cleanly, by the rules as they existed, and he showed courage and leadership. These qualities deserve acknowledgement even as we recognize the ultimately destructive nature of his work. His story reminds us that history is made by individuals, that personal choices and qualities matter, even in events as large as world wars. Had Richthofen been less disciplined, less talented, less dedicated, the air war over the Western Front would have unfolded differently. He was not irreplaceable, no individual is, but he was significant, and his influence extended beyond his lifetime. We must also remember that Richthofen was a product of his time and place. He was raised with certain values, trained in certain ways, placed in circumstances not of his choosing. He responded to those circumstances with the tools and understanding he possessed. To expect him to have had the moral clarity or historical perspective that we possess a century later is unreasonable. We can learn from studying his life without either lionizing him uncritically or condemning him anachronistically. A century on, It has now been over a century since Manfred von Richthofen died in that field in France. Everyone who knew him personally is gone. The world he knew has been transformed beyond recognition. The empires he served has vanished. The aircraft he flew exist only in museums and in restored examples maintained by dedicated enthusiasts. Even the landscape of the Western Front has healed, though the cemeteries remain, endless rows of white crosses marking where the generation of 1914 lies buried. Yet, the story endures. In an age of drone warfare and stealth technology, of conflicts fought from control rooms thousands of miles from the battlefield, there remains something compelling about the image of the Red Baron, a lone warrior in an open cockpit, testing himself against the sky and against worthy opponents, fighting with skill and courage, even as he knew that each flight might be his last. Perhaps what draws us to his story is the human scale of it. We can understand single combat between individuals in a way that we cannot grasp the immensity of modern warfare. We can appreciate skill and courage and discipline. We can imagine ourselves in that cockpit, facing those choices, testing ourselves against those challenges. The fact that we almost certainly would have failed, would have been among the countless pilots who died in their first weeks of combat, does not diminish the appeal of the story. Or perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps we tell the story of the Red Baron because it is a good story, well suited to the human love of narrative. It has a clear protagonist, rising action, a climax, and a tragic conclusion. It has mystery. We still debate who fired the fatal shot. It has meaning that extends beyond the immediate events. It speaks to larger themes of duty, mortality, skill, and sacrifice. It is, in short, the kind of story that humans have been telling since we first gathered around fires in caves, trying to make sense of our world and our place in it. The last flight into legend, as the sun sets over the fields of the Somme, as it has set every evening for the century since the Red Baron fell, we are left with a man and a myth, inextricably intertwined. Manfred von Richthofen was not superhuman. He was a young man who found himself extraordinarily good at a terrible job during a terrible time. He did that job with discipline and skill until it killed him. Everything else, the legend, the symbolism, the endless retellings, came after. But that, after, matters too. The fact that we still tell his story, that we still debate the details of his life and death, that we still find meaning in his example, says something important about us, and about how we engage with history. We need heroes, even complicated ones. We need stories of skill and courage, even when those qualities are employed in destructive ends. We need to believe that individual excellence matters, even in the midst of forces larger than any individual. The Red Baron gave us that story. Not intentionally, he was simply doing his duty as he understood it, but effectively nonetheless. His red Fokker triplane became a symbol that transcended its immediate purpose, a marker of human potential and human tragedy, inextricably bound together. In the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to Manfred von Richthofen is not any physical monument, but the fact that his story continues to be told, examined, and pondered more than a century after his death. He has achieved a kind of immortality, not through the 80 victories he scored, but through the enduring human fascination with his life and what it represents. The skies he once dominated are empty of war now, at least over the fields of France where he fought and died. Commercial aircraft trace contrails across the blue, carrying passengers who likely do not know that below them, a century ago, young men fought and died in canvas-covered machines that would seem impossibly primitive to our modern eyes. The war that consumed Richthofen and millions of others is history now, studied in schools, commemorated in ceremonies, but no longer a living memory. Yet something of that era endures in the story of the Red Baron, a reminder of what humans are capable of, for both good and ill, a testament to skill and courage, a warning about the cost of war, a symbol that continues to fly through our collective imagination. The red triplane forever frozen in that moment between glory and tragedy, between life and legend, between the man he was and the myth he became. And so the story concludes where it must, with the image we cannot shake. A young man in a field in France, 25 years old, slumped in the cockpit of his distinctive red aircraft, having flown his last flight, having faced his final combat, having earned his place in history not through seeking it but through simply being extraordinarily good at what he did until the moment when his luck finally ran out. The engine is silent, the guns are still, the legend takes flight.